One cold autumn evening, 19-year-old Emily was home alone in her family's secluded farmhouse. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and her younger brother was at a friend's house. Emily loved the solitude, the crackling of the fireplace, and the quiet creaks of the old house. It felt cozy, safe, until it didn't. The evening began uneventfully. Emily settled on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through her phone and occasionally glancing at the movie playing on TV. Around 9 p.m., she heard a soft knock at the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. No one ever came by this far out, especially not at night. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the dark, moonlit porch. Convinced it was just her imagination, she shook it off and went back to the couch. Moments later, there was another knock, this time louder. She froze. Her dog Max, who usually barked at any unusual sound, sat silently, staring at the door with his ears pinned back. A chill ran down her spine. Gathering her courage, Emily flipped on the porch light and opened the door a crack. The porch was empty, but a faint rhythmic tapping sound came from the side of the house. Grabbing her phone, Emily called her best friend, Jess, who lived a few miles away. Jess assured her it was probably nothing, maybe the wind or a branch against the window. Emily tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. She double-checked the locks and closed the curtains tightly, determined to ignore the strange noises. An hour passed, and the house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards. Emily decided to head upstairs to her room. As she ascended the creaky staircase, she felt a sudden wave of nausea, a sensation she couldn't quite explain. It was as if something unseen was watching her every move. Just as she reached the top of the stairs, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you open the door?" Emily's stomach dropped. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was this a cruel prank? She texted back, "Who is this?" But there was no reply. Panic set in. Emily hurried to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That someone had knocked on her door and sent a creepy text? It felt like overreacting, but deep down she knew something was wrong. Minutes crawled by, and then her phone buzzed again. This time the text read, "I'm already inside." Her blood ran cold. She scanned the room, her eyes darting to the closet, the shadows under the bed, the window. Everything appeared normal. She held her breath, straining to hear any sound, any hint of movement. Then she noticed it, a faint scratching noise coming from the hallway outside her room. Clutching a pair of scissors from her desk, Emily pressed her ear to the door. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. Her trembling hands hovered over her phone, debating whether to dial 911. Before she could decide, there was a soft click. The doorknob was turning. Emily screamed, her voice echoing through the empty house. The doorknob jiggled violently, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. She waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Gathering her courage, she cracked the door open, scissors in hand. The hallway was empty, but the attic pull-down ladder was now hanging open. Emily stared at it, her mind screaming at her to run. Instead, she grabbed her phone and backed away slowly. As she turned to flee, a figure dropped silently from the attic, tall, gaunt, and dressed in tattered black clothing. Emily barely had time to process what she saw before the intruder lunged at her. She threw the scissors, narrowly missing him, and bolted down the stairs, screaming for help. The farmhouse seemed to stretch endlessly as she ran. Behind her, the man's heavy footsteps pounded the floor. She reached the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and turned to face him. But he was gone. The house was eerily quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Shaking, Emily ran outside, dialing 911. The police arrived within minutes and searched the house. They found no one, but in the attic, they discovered a makeshift bed, food wrappers, and a diary. The entries revealed that the intruder had been living there for weeks, watching Emily and her family, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. Emily never stayed in that house again. The thought of someone lurking in her home, watching her every move, haunted her for the rest of her life. To this day, she still wonders, what would have happened if she hadn't screamed?
Story number 2.
Late one stormy night, Jake sat alone in his small apartment on the outskirts of town. A young college student, he had stayed back to finish a project while his roommates went out of town for the weekend. The building was old, with thin walls that amplified every creak and groan. The rain hammered against the windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder made the place feel even lonelier. Around 11 p.m., just as Jake was starting to wrap up his work, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his roommate, Kyle. "Hey, can you check the front door? I think I left it unlocked." Jake found it odd. Kyle had left hours ago, and it wasn't like him to forget something so basic. But Jake shrugged it off. Maybe Kyle had been in a rush. Jake walked to the door, checked the lock, and texted back, "All good. It's locked." Almost immediately, a reply came through. "I didn't send that text." Jake froze. His eyes darted to the locked door in front of him. It was impossible. Kyle's phone was with him out of town. The logical explanation was that it was a prank, but something about it felt wrong. He typed back, "Stop messing with me. You're not funny." There was no response. The air in the apartment grew heavy, suffocating. Jake returned to his desk, trying to shake off the unease. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was worse. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Jake's blood ran cold as he hadn't opened the door. He glanced around, the silence of the room suddenly feeling sinister. The sound of the rain outside seemed muted, drowned out by his pounding heartbeat. He stood up, every nerve in his body on edge, and checked the locks again. Both the door and the windows were secure. Then he heard it, a soft, deliberate creak coming from the hallway behind him. Jake turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor that led to the bedrooms. He swore he could feel eyes on him, but the hallway was empty. Grabbing a heavy flashlight from his desk, he crept down the hall. With each step, the creaking floor seemed to mock his growing fear. As he reached the end of the hallway, he saw the bathroom door slightly ajar. He could have sworn he'd left it closed. Summoning all his courage, Jake pushed the door open with the flashlight, revealing nothing. The small bathroom was empty. Relief flooded him for a moment, but then his phone buzzed again. The message read, "I see you." Jake's hands shook as he backed out of the bathroom. His breathing quickened as he felt the distinct sensation of someone watching him. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise coming from his bedroom, a muffled shuffle, like fabric dragging across the floor. The bedroom door was slightly open, and through the crack, he could see movement. Jake's mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? No, it was too deliberate. Slowly, he stepped closer, every fiber of his being screaming at him to run. He pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of his computer monitor. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes adjusted, and he noticed something horrifying. A figure crouched in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. It was a man, pale and gaunt, wearing a tattered hoodie. His face was obscured by greasy hair, but his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, gleamed in the faint light. Jake's scream caught in his throat as the man stood up, his movements unnaturally slow, almost predatory. Without thinking, Jake bolted down the hallway toward the front door. Behind him, the man moved fast, his heavy footsteps pounding the floor. Jake reached the door, but his trembling hands fumbled with the lock. The man was almost upon him when, miraculously, Jake managed to fling the door open and sprint out into the rain. He didn't stop running until he reached a neighbor's apartment, pounding on the door until they let him in. The police arrived minutes later and searched Jake's apartment. They found no one, but the bedroom window, which Jake was certain had been locked, was now wide open. Beneath it, muddy footprints trailed into the darkness outside. Jake never spent another night in that apartment. To this day, he can't explain how the man got in or why he didn't try to harm him. The only clue was a single note left on Jake's desk, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You were supposed to stay alone."
Story number 3.
It was the dead of winter, and Sarah had just moved into a charming old Victorian house she'd rented in a small town. It was her first time living alone, and she was excited to finally have a place to herself. The house was beautiful, but it had a peculiar quality, a strange chill that seemed to linger no matter how high she turned up the heat. The first few nights were uneventful, though Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She attributed it to the creaks and groans of an old house settling. But on the fourth night, as she was lying in bed scrolling through her phone, she heard something that made her blood turn cold, a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was coming from outside. She got up, peered through the frosted window, and saw nothing but the snowy street. Then she heard it again. This time, it was clearer. It sounded like her name, Sarah. Her heart pounded as she strained to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the house. She grabbed her phone and tiptoed into the hallway. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was so deep, it was suffocating. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind. Climbing back into bed, she wrapped herself in blankets and tried to sleep. Around 3 a.m., she woke up suddenly, her chest tight with an unexplainable dread. The room was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of her bedside lamp. That's when she noticed it, a shadow that didn't belong. At the foot of her bed, the outline of a figure stood perfectly still. Its shape was wrong, too tall and lanky, with limbs that seemed unnaturally long. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone, but her fingers were trembling so violently she could barely unlock it. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as if watching her. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah whispered, "Who's there?" The shadow melted into the darkness, vanishing before her eyes. By morning, Sarah convinced herself it had been a vivid nightmare. But the next night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, insistent, as though they were trying to draw her to the basement. She tried to ignore them, but when the sound of scratching echoed through the house, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. The basement was freezing and smelled of damp earth. As she descended the creaking stairs, the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. In the far corner of the basement, she saw something that made her stomach lurch, a small wooden door she hadn't noticed before. It was partly ajar, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to absorb the light. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but she was drawn forward, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. As she reached the door, the whispers grew deafening, surrounding her like a cacophony of voices pleading, warning, and laughing all at once. She opened the door wider, shining the flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a narrow crawl space filled with dusty, crumbling walls. But what made her scream was the writing. Scrawled across the walls in what looked like charcoal were hundreds of words, repeating over and over, "Sarah! Sarah! Sarah!" She stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand and plunging the room into darkness. Then she felt it, a hand, ice cold and skeletal, brushing against her shoulder. Sarah bolted up the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. She locked herself in her bedroom and called the police. When they arrived, they found no one in the house, but they did find the crawl space. Inside it, they discovered a rusted box containing old photographs, all of them of Sarah. Some were recent, taken in her new house. The police were baffled. They questioned Sarah, but she had no explanation. She left the house that night and never returned. To this day, she doesn't know who or what had been watching her, or how they had been taking those photos. All she knows is that sometimes, when she's alone, she still hears her name whispered softly in the dark.